As we know, swing states play a crucial role in determining our elections. But in this video, we're going to analyze what happened to swing states in blowout elections. As an example, in 1884, as we all know, the election came down to New York, which Cleveland won by less than a tenth of a percent. In 1876, the election came down to a bunch of Republican swing states, most notably South Carolina, which Hayes won, by around half a percent. In 1888, the election came down to Indiana and New York, which were both very close states. But then you have elections like 1896, or more notable than even that, 1900, or to be more honest with you, 1904, which is a blowout. In 1904, over half of the electoral votes voted for Teddy Roosevelt by over 18%. And the tipping point in that election was New Jersey at 18.63%. Note that the Jackson Jew map is wrong because 7 of the 8 votes in Maryland went blue, and they have the state going red. But Maryland was a very close state in this election. You also have Missouri, which was another swing state that the Republicans won by 4%, and Kentucky, which Democrats won by 2.7%. Those are close states in a blowout. All of these states were significantly more Democratic than the nation at large by between 15 and 20 percentage points. And this makes sense because these were also border states where Democrats tended to do the best. They tended to do the best in these close border states. And, in these close border states, that's where they tended to do the best. And as a result, the only other states that were weaker for Roosevelt were Colorado, which was strongly blue in 1900 and especially 1896 because of the whole gold standard thing. West Virginia and Indiana weren't too strong either. Those are both border states. Same with Delaware. And for some reason, New York was only an 11% margin of victory for Roosevelt, which I don't understand. 1912 is another example where you have a bunch of these states that vote for Wilson by landslides, and a lot of that came down to the fact that that Teddy Roosevelt had split the vote. If we look at this from a popular vote perspective, notice how Wilson only won 42% of the popular vote, but the Republican vote was split between Roosevelt and Taft. And as a result, we saw Wilson win in a landslide. And while there were plenty of swing states, there were plenty of close states, it was just so hard to analyze what happened because this was the best case scenario for Democrats. Now, obviously, in 1916, the election would come down to swing states, but not in 1920. There were only two states that were under 5%. Kentucky voted for 0.5% for the Democrats, Tennessee by 3% for the Republicans. Kentucky was a border state. Tennessee was a former Confederate state, but it was the one that was most willing to elect Republicans in the Solid South era, hence it was the first to break. And again, Solid South, this is where traditionally, again, as I said, we've seen Democrats do the best in this era. But these are border states, so it's more iffy on this. These states voted by about 25% more Republican than the nation at large, and I'm being serious as I say that. However, what you have to understand here is that Republicans, had such a landslide year, but these were such, blue states that's sort of what it means when I do this. It's interesting to note, though, that in a close election, Wilson only won Kentucky by 5 as he won Tennessee by 13.6. And there were several states that were solid for Wilson that then moved solidly for Harding. And it's interesting to note that Kentucky actually had a minimal swing towards the Republicans. As a matter of fact, Republicans national landslide was most resisted in North Carolina and Kentucky. 1924, another landslide where the tipping point state was over 15%. And not only that, you also had states like Montana and North Dakota where La Follette was the reason why these races were so close. As La Follette had a lot of strong influence in this area. In this election, Kentucky and Maryland were the two closest states that where it wasn't populists. This was such a blowout election, as a matter of fact, that despite the vote being split, with the Democrats because of La Follette, Coolidge still would have won the election anyway. It was that much of a blowout. But Kentucky and Maryland, again, two border states where you sort of have these conflicting political influences as to how these states are generally more Democratic leaning, but Republicans can win them. 1928 had more swing states. You had New York and Texas on a Republican side, Alabama, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island on the Democratic side. Al Smith's Catholicism made him a bit more popular in the Northeast, and this is sort of when New York, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island would become the most Democratic states in the Northeast. Whereas, Al Smith's Catholicism made him a weak candidate in a solid South, but this was still a generally Democratic-leaning area, hence why some states we saw very little damage to the Democrats relative to the previous elections. Alabama, though, it was enough to make it close, and it was enough to flip Virginia, Tennessee, North Carolina, Florida, and Texas. Texas, of course, being the closest. So that's how you had those swing states. 1932 was a landslide for Democrats. In 1928, this tipping point state was Illinois at almost 15 percentage points. In 1932, the tipping point state was Iowa at almost 18. Not saying they didn't have any close states, though, because you had plenty. On the Republican side, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Delaware were there because the Northeast was still Hoover's strongest region. On the Democratic side, you had New Jersey, Ohio, and Massachusetts. States where, these are states where they're more Republican because they weren't as damaged by the Great Depression as most of the rest of the country was. So that's an interesting tidbit, too, as to how Massachusetts barely improved towards Democrats. It only swung to them by around 3%, despite the election, looking at it from a perspective of the popular vote, despite that, despite the popular vote flipping to the Democrats by roughly 34 percentage points. And notice how 392 electoral college votes wound up flipping to the Democrats. 1936 was a huge landslide. New Hampshire was the only close state. Again, historically one of the most Republican states in the Northeast. However, during this time, the landslide was just so strong that even New Hampshire went blue, but it wouldn't flip back. Roosevelt would actually improve. However, these elections aren't really blowouts anymore. Look at what the tipping point is. In 1940, the tipping point state came down to Pennsylvania at 6.9%. And in 1944, the tipping point state came down to New York at 5%. In both cases, the popular vote was also in a single digit. You had tons of swing states that actually determined the election. Even though the states under 5% would not determine this election in this example, New York, under the scenario, becomes as close as New York was in 1884 or as close as Florida was in 2000. So these 1940 and 1944, they were electoral college landslides, but they weren't landslides in reality. And 1948 was obviously a very close election. It shouldn't have been a close election. It should have been a bigger landslide in 1944, but this is what happens when the party is split three ways. And again, you can see the continued influence of Massachusetts, New York, and Rhode Island being the three most Democratic states in the Northeast, seeing as if not for Wallace, New York goes pretty strongly towards the Democrats. 52 is a pretty big landslide towards the Republicans, I would say. You had South Carolina, West Virginia, and Kentucky as swing states for the Democrats. And for the Republicans, you had Tennessee, Missouri, Delaware, and Rhode Island. Again, lots of these states in the Northeast are now starting to shift towards Democrats, and of course the border states too. Plus, note in South Carolina, there was starting to be some opposition towards the Democrats because of their support for civil rights. 56, we would see North Carolina and Missouri be the swing states for the Democrats, and Tennessee be a swing state for the Republicans. Again, the Florida was a tipping point at 14.5. These states were about 15% more Democratic than the nation as a whole. Because, again, whole border state philosophy. 64, we would actually Republicans have their strongest base in the South. So Arizona was 1% for Republicans. Again, it was historically a Republican-leaning state. And you also had the fact that Barry Goldwater's home state was Arizona. Idaho was 2%. Again, a state that was going to become one of the most Republican in the nation. The only time past this was Republican by less than 15 percentage points was in 1992 when Bush still won the state by 14. In Florida at 2%, where it was sort of bordering on the Deep South, and that's sort of why this was so close in Florida. 1972, you didn't have any state under 5%. The one state that went blue was Massachusetts at 9%, and the closest state at 5.5% was Nixon's win in Minnesota. 1980 was a bit of a blowout as well, but you had plenty of swing states, hence why the tipping point state is actually less than what you'd expect. It was Illinois at 7.9%. 1984 was a landslide. Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Minnesota were the swing states here. Again, some of the most Democratic leading states in the nation at the time, so it's no surprise why these states were the closest, as these states all went over 15 percentage points more Democratic than the nation at large. There weren't really too many blowouts past this point. The swing states really made a difference in every single election. 1984 was the last true blowout. 1996 sure was kind of a blowout, and it didn't really have too many close states for Democrats, but even then it was still in the single digits. It was still, in the single digits. And a lot of the swing states like Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, Texas, Colorado, South Dakota, and Montana went for the Republicans. Nevada, Arizona, Kentucky, and Tennessee were the only close states to actually break for the Democrats in this election. In 1982, obviously had a ton of swing states, seeing as a tipping point state was actually Tennessee at 5%. The next big landslide was 2008, and even then, that wasn't really that big of a blowout. I mean, sure, it was a bit of a landslide, but the swing states still played a role. And that's that, Now you're starting to get to the swing states determining elections. I was just going to go for where it wasn't because of them being much more Democratic or Republican than the nation at whole, large in a landslide.